In this video, we are going to talk about Sevalla's database offering, which is one of Sevalla's core services, which makes managing databases very simple and it is a very powerful feature. So we'll talk about everything surrounding databases and the ecosystem. Now, before we jump in, let's talk about why choosing the right database hosting is very important for your software, your business, or whatever you are building. The traditional database management, it involves setting up servers, whether in AWS or GCP or Azure, wherever you are hosting your infrastructure in. You have to set your servers first. You have to configure security. You have to manage your backups, and you have to handle scaling of your databases as your user base increases every day, and also deal with the maintenance. And that's a lot of overhead that keeps you away from worrying about building your application instead of all this maintenance and scaling headache. So that is the motivation for us, and Sevalla's database hosting, it eliminates all of that, all the complexity that we talked about, and it gives you enterprise grade reliability. We'll talk about what enterprise grade features are available, and it also gives you automatic backups and the flexibility to scale as you grow. You don't have to worry about that on your day one. The first thing that we want to talk about is what are the offerings, what are the database offerings that we have available in Sevalla. So the first thing is Redis, which we already used in the last video, where we were hosting a background job worker, which is BullMQ using Node.js. And there we created a Redis instance and integrated it into our background job worker service. So Sevalla offers Redis as a service, and you can use Redis for things like caching, session storage, real-time analytics, and any kind of scenario where you need very fast data access. So think user sessions, leaderboards, or caching frequently accessed API data, right? It's very flexible. You also get Valky, which is a new Redis compatible option that provides similar functionality to Redis, but it has a few architectural differences. So some companies these days are going for Valky instead of Redis. So you can also look into that. Apart from that, we have three database options available, the traditional relational databases. First is MariaDB, which is a MySQL alternative. Now, MariaDB started as a MySQL fork, but has evolved with its own features over the time. It's particularly good for applications that need MySQL compatibility, but they also want some of the features that only MariaDB offers. In those cases, you can go with MariaDB. Then we also have MySQL, which is very similar to MariaDB, but it has its own path and own set of features. It is one of the most widely used databases so far, and it is perfect for pretty much any kind of application. It is pretty versatile, whether you're talking about traditional web applications or e-commerce platforms or content management systems. For example, if you're building a WordPress application, a typical web app with user accounts and content, then MySQL is often the go-to choice. Sevalla supports both 8.0 and 9.0 versions of MySQL. And the last thing is Postgres. Postgres is, again, one of the most popular database choices, especially when we are talking about the recent times. It is incredibly powerful for basic applications to very complex full stack applications. And Sevalla supports a wide range of Postgres versions, starting from 9.6 up to the recent version is 17. One of the distinct features of Postgres is its JSON support. So if you are thinking between whether you should go with MongoDB, a NoSQL database, or something like relational database of Postgres, then going with Postgres, it is a pretty no-brainer, because you get all the nice features of relational database with Postgres and also JSON support, for which you are considering MongoDB for. Those are all the choices of databases that you get when you host your database in Sevalla, which pretty much covers all the use cases for modern web applications when we are thinking about database. Now, talking about the infrastructure a little bit, as you already know, all of Sevalla's infrastructure runs on Google Cloud. So databases also, they run on Google Cloud platforms, top tier infrastructure, and your database gets the same enterprise grade reliability that Google offers its own services. So that is a pretty huge deal. And when you create a new database, you have to choose between 25 data centers worldwide. This means that you can place your database geographically closer to your users for optimal performance if you're going for a strategy like that. But I would recommend keeping your database closer to your server is more important than keeping it near to your users. So the ultimate strategy should be keeping both your servers and your database closer to your users, not only one of them. And the database runs in its own containerized environment, not alongside your primary servers, so that it is easier to scale it independently. So let's do one thing. Let's see how we can create a database in Sevalla, and we'll walk through how it all works. Come to your dashboard, and from dashboard, you can click on this databases tab in the sidebar and click on add database. This is the Redis instance that we created in the last video when we were talking about the background job worker. Clicking on the add database, we have all these options available that we saw in the docs just now. We have Postgres, we have MySQL, MariaDB, Redis, and Valky. For this demo, we are going with Postgres, and the version that we'll select is 17, but we also have a lot of options available in case you have some kind of legacy support needed. If you want, you can also enable pgvector extension and PostGIS extension. So pgvector is if you need support for vector similarity search. These days, similarity search is pretty widely used. So if you need capabilities like that, you can enable it, and that extension will be installed in your database. Same way for PostGIS in case you need support for geographic objects and location kind of data. For database, let's name it Next demo. Database user, will leave it as it is, and the database password will also, the auto-generated password is fine. The name of the database instance will say Postgres, and then comes the location. Now, as I said, you should always choose the location of your database closer to the server which is going to interact with your database. Since we are connecting our server and our database through internal connection, it is important that both of them are in the same region, in the same data center, so that internal connection works. The second thing to keep in mind is to decrease the amount of latency between our server and our database. It is important that both of them are closer. That's why we're going with Mumbai, which is the same region, same data center where we have hosted our Next.js server. And for resources, the minimum amount of resources is fine since this is just a demo application. And after that, let's click on create. After you click on create, we land here, the overview screen of our database. And the details part is something that we have configured. We have created a Postgres database of version 17. Then this is the data center location of our database. Is the creation date, and this is the resource that we have assigned, which is 0.25 core CPU and 0.25 GB of RAM. And this is the database size that we are given, which is the 1 GB by default. This part is important, the connections. We have already talked about a lot about internal connection and external connection, but let's do a refresher here since we will be demoing this in this video. Internal connection is something which is very special in what Sevalla offers to developers. If you host both your application and your database on Sevalla, you can create a private network. So let's say this is your application and this is your database. So, and this, let's say, is the internet. So instead of going through the internet and connecting to the database, Sevalla offers something called a private network or an internal connection where you can directly connect to your database through the shortest path. Since both of them are hosted in the same network infrastructure, your applications can connect to your database through this private network, through this internal connection, which provides first security, and the second thing is latency. The minimum amount of the connections are pretty fast, and the last thing is the big advantage, which is you are not charged for the bandwidth that is caused through the internal network or through the private network, right? Pretty impressive deal. Now in the internal connection, we are given a couple of fields. One is the host, then the port, which is the default port of Postgres is 5432, is the database name, is the user, this is the password, and the field that we are interested in is the URL. If you want to connect to our database from our web application through internal networking, then we'll need this URL. And later on, when we are trying to connect, we'll copy this URL and we'll place it in the environment variable so that web application can connect to our database. There is also an option for external connection. Now, external connection is when you want to connect to this database through internet outside of Sevalla's network infrastructure. In that case, you can use external connection. Now you will be charged for the bandwidth that happens in the external connection. For this, what you have to do, you have to enable public access. Once you have enabled the public access, now your database is ready for external connections to the database. Now, one interesting feature that is provided here is the open deep link button here. Now, they have provided a very convenient way to connect from this software, which is called Table Plus. Table Plus, which is a database management software, which I personally use. It is very clean, it is very fast, and it works in pretty much all the platforms. It has a very modern UI, very minimalistic UI, and it's great for day-to-day use of any kind of developer. So I have been personally using Table Plus for years now, and it is pretty convenient that Sevalla has this button. When you click on it, it triggers a deep link, which means it will open this particular database URL in Table Plus. So let's click on this, open Table Plus, which directly opens our database through this UI, through this Table Plus UI. Here we can run our SQL queries. As of now, we don't have any kind of tables, but if you want, we can create tables here. So let's say we say that create table sample, and we'll just keep one field, a field called the name, and it will be of type text. Let's try to execute this, and we can see that this table was executed, and if we do a refresh here, it should appear in our tables. If you want, we can add entries also. Let's say if we go back to the SQL query, clear this, and we run an insert statement, which is insert into sample values. Yes, here we'll say random, and let's say we execute this and click on this table and do a refresh, and we can see that one entry is created here and the value is random string, right? So we were able to create a database and enable public access for that, and we were able to connect to the database through internet, through external connection from our local instance of Table Plus. So this is how the public connection thing works if you want to access your database over the internet. For now, let's disable it, since we only want to interact with our database from our web application. So we can disable this now. And here, when we finally connect our web application to our database, that will appear here. So let's say if we create add connection and we select our Next.js app, that will appear here, and we'll come back to this later on. And finally, from here, we can, if you want to, change our password, database password. We also have a database studio available here. So if you click on studio, we can interact with our database. We can explore our database, the tables and their entries, or directly from the Sevalla dashboard. As you can see here, in our Table Plus, we executed an SQL query to create a table called sample. And we also inserted a field in the name column called random string. If you want, we can add a record here, and let's say we name it something else, and we save it, and another record is created here. And if you want, we can make any kind of modifications here. If we want to delete this table, then we can just say drop. And we want to also drop all the objects related to this schema, and we say drop table, and that will delete our table. Pretty convenient if you want to just quickly explore what are the data available in your tables, and if you want to modify them, update them, delete them, add new records, you can do that directly from Sevalla's dashboard. You don't need any external database management software. Now going back, we also have an analytics tab. From here again, you can see things like what amount of storage that you are using at this moment, the memory uses of your database, and the CPU usage. Accordingly, you can decide whether you should increase the storage, whether you should take a bigger instance for your database computation power. You can take those decisions by depending and by understanding the data points that are available to you in this analytics tab. Another important thing that we have here is the backups, because data protection is very important. If you are running any kind of important software, you have thousands of users, and it is critical that you protect the data of your users at any cost, both from malicious access and from it getting lost. And Sevalla takes this very seriously with a very comprehensive backup system provided to you. Every Sevalla database, it gets daily backup, and it is stored for 7 days, as it is mentioned here. And this happens automatically. You don't have to configure anything. All your databases will automatically get backups every day and the backup will be retained for the next 7 days. And in this backup page, you can see all your daily backups with the timestamp when it was backed up. And each backup is a complete point in time snapshot of your database, including the data inside that. So if at some point you want to restore, so let's say we deleted our table. If you want to restore to that point of time, including all your data, then you can do that by clicking on this restore button. You also have an option for manual backups, because sometimes you need more control over when you want to take a backup. Let's say you are doing some kind of critical migration, and before that you want to take a manual backup, just to be sure, just to have an option so that you can roll back if something goes wrong. And you can create up to 5 manual backups, and they will be stored for next 14 days, as it is mentioned here. Whenever you are doing a manual backup, you should add a very descriptive note here. For example, if you are taking a backup before your database migration, your schema migration, then you can write something like before schema migration here, so that it is easier to understand when this backup was taken and what purpose this was taken for, so that it is easier to roll back and it is easier to manage in times of crisis. You also have a user management tab here. If you want to give access to this particular database to certain users inside your company, then you can invite users which will only have access to this database and not any other application in your company. If you want permissions that granular, then you can go for this option. This is very convenient if you want to give access to, let's say, your sales users to look at some data and explore the data using Database Studio, but you don't want to give them access to your critical web applications or your servers. And that's pretty much all we need to know about the options that we have available in the database. Next up, let's look at how we can connect to our database and how we can interact with our database using a application. So what we'll do, we already have a Next.js application, and we'll add database support to that, and we'll deploy that, and we'll see if everything works fine in our production. We have already created a database, so we don't need to do that anymore. So let's just directly go to the code, and some of the things that we have added here is the Postgres driver that we are going to use. And the ORM that we are going to use is Drizzle ORM, which is a very popular ORM for TypeScript ecosystem. And those are all we need for this database demo. The next thing that we need is a Drizzle config file. So let's run npm install. That should get rid of all the errors. This is our Drizzle config file where we have added different configs for our database connections. This is where all our schema is. This is where all our migrations are. And this is going to be our database URL, and we are going to provide it using Sevalla's application environment variable. Okay. Next up, we can take a look at this database. The migrations are auto-generated, so you don't have to worry about that. We can take a look at the config where we are initializing a new pool and providing it for our database connection. Next thing is our schema. We have a couple of tables. One is the users table, which has ID, email, name, and some default timestamps. Same way, we also have posts, which have ID, title, content, when it was published, who was the author who wrote this post, and some default timestamps. And these are the relations between user and post. So it basically says that one user can have many posts, and a post can only have one author. And these are the foreign keys. We also have queries, so that we can run different operations on our database. One is create user, which takes the data for a new user, which name, email, which are the mandatory fields, and others are optional. The same way, if you want to fetch a user by its ID, then it is taking an ID, which is a string field, and it is running this particular database query and returning a user. Same way for getting a user with all its posts, to create a post, to get all the published posts, to update a post, etc. Now going back to our application, we have a couple of endpoints created. We have one for creating a new user, which is a post endpoint, and which is going to take a request, which will have things like the name of the author, the email of the author, and it is going to call this function, this database function, which is actually going to create the user. And we also have a get endpoint to get a particular user and the data associated with that user. The same way, we also have two endpoints for our posts, for creating a new post and for getting or fetching all the posts that we have available in our app. These are the API endpoints. Now finally, we have created a page inside our app, which is called database demo. And inside that, what we are doing, we are providing a user interface basically to test our database connection, to run all these database queries, and to make sure that our database connection is working fine and we are able to interact with Sevalla's database. One last thing that we also have is a script which performs migration. Now we have created this so that after our deployment is successful, we are going to apply our migrations using Sevalla's one-time job that we saw in the previous videos. And we are going to make use of that feature to apply all the database migrations after our application deployment is successful. So let's go back to our Sevalla dashboard, go to applications and click on our Next.js application. And here we need to add a job. So let's create job and we'll name it database migration. And the start command for this is going to be, if we look at the package.json, it is going to be db migrate. So it is going to be npm run db migrate. And when do you want to run this? I particularly want to run this after a successful deployment, right? And the instance size, let's go with hobby, which is more than enough for this test application, and click on create. And this is fine. We have added this. Let's get rid of this background worker, which we don't need anymore. Let's click on delete. Okay, now we are ready. One last thing that we need to do is connect our database to our application. We don't need this Redis connection anymore. So let's do one thing. Let's just go ahead and delete this Redis database. And the Redis instance is gone now. If we go back to our Next.js app, this connector service is gone. Now what we need to do, we need to add our database to our application because they need to communicate with each other for this database demo. So let's select our Postgres service and add this. What happens with this is Sevalla automatically suggests some of the environment variables that we might need to connect to our database. What we need is actually a database URL environment variable. We don't need this, we don't need this, not this, not this, not this. And finally, update this name to database URL, okay, which automatically add this URL for our internal connection, and click on add connection. And now if you go to our overview screen, we can see that the entry point is the Cloudflare network. Then we have our primary web process. We also have a one-off job for applying our database migration, and our database is connected to our application with this internal connection, right? Everything is set up now. Now let's go back to our deployments. We want to do a manual deployment, not our main branch, which does not have the database features. We want to deploy our database branch. Okay. Now let's click on deploy application, which starts a new deployment. Let's click on this so that we know what's going on. It is going to be a Nix packs based deployment. Let's wait for the logs, then we can see if everything was successful. And in a few minutes, both our web process and our one-off job, both are deployed successfully. The one-off job has run and our migrations are applied successfully. If you want to verify it, we can go to our database and we can go to the studio, and here we'll see the names of both the tables that we have created in our migration. So let's go ahead and see if we can run our demo successfully for testing our database connection. So the path was database demo, and here let's try to add a new user. I'll create a user with my name. The email is mine, and click on create user, which creates a new user here, which means our database is working fine. You can also verify it by going to our database again and going to studio. And this is the user that we just created. Great. The database connection is working fine. Let's also try to create a post. This is my post. This is the post content. Author is me, and click on create post, and the post is also created. We do a refresh, then both the users and the posts should be fetched successfully. So that is pretty much all I wanted to talk about databases. We saw what are all the features, what are all the different kinds of databases offered by Sevalla, and also how to connect to Sevalla's database, both using external connection and internal connection or private connection.